Hello, everyone, and welcome to this morning, afternoon session of Directing Colour with Ollie. Kenchington, how are you doing today? You okay, mate?
I'm very well, mate. How are you?
Yeah, all good, all good. Ready for the weekend, ready to relax.
Oh, yes, indeed. This week's gone really fast, actually. It's very strange. Well, in fact, the whole lockdown
Yep.
has gone super, super fast. The last 3 months have just disappeared.
It's
Um,
crazy how fast everything's gone. So we're just like reflecting at this whole thing at the moment, and one of
mm,
the bits of data we had was we've done 42 unique events over
oh,
like since lockdown's begun, which is insane.
that is
Which is like
crazy.
I think it's like 70 hours worth of content,
Oh, gosh.
which
Wow.
is more content than I've made for CVP in the entirety that I've worked for them, which is
They're going to
absolutely
expect those
insane.
kind of numbers
Oh,
forever now, Jake.
oh, it's
You've
so
got to run
much.
for your own back.
But yeah, and luckily, some of my favorite content we've been doing is with yourself, so I'm glad.
Oh, Jake, you charmer. Bless you. I was going to say how unfortunate that 40 of those 42 events were middle-aged, bald, fat guy on camera going,
No,
"Colour's really important, everybody." Oh dear.
no, it's,
Well,
they're awesome, dude.
they're awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, on that wonderful introduction, let's crack on with directing color. Now, I was meant to do this talk for everybody. I think it was like the 17th of April or something. I can't remember when it was. It was back in April. It was actually meant to be the first of these series of webinars with CVP, and I strained my voice, my delicate voice, and couldn't talk, and so we had to postpone it. So it literally just got picked up and lumped at the end. So today is going to be the last webinar I'm doing with CVP for definitely the next couple of weeks. It probably won't be till July, I think, until I'm doing any more. So you get some respite from me, you beautiful people out there. But directing color is, and what we're going to be talking about this morning, is all about incorporating color choices and a color look into every aspect of your production. The key thing is kind of getting your head around moving from potentially only thinking about color, well, if at all, but only thinking about it potentially at the end of the process. It's very common for people to plan meticulously the shoot, and the edit comes together, and then at the last minute it's kind of like, well, what look should we put on there? And lots of good stuff gets made actually, that doesn't put color first and foremost. But that's not to say that things can't be even better if color has a bit more of a role. And as my whole job revolves around color and promoting its use to tell stories in a better way and to more vividly bring films to life with the use of color and contrast, I thought it was very relevant to kind of talk about this, because there are productions, few and far between, unfortunately, and this is kind of what I want to try and encourage more of. But certainly at the level I'm operating at, they're relatively few and far between. But there are the odd production where I'm brought in pre-production to help. Even though I'm going to be, doing the bulk of my work, obviously at the end of post-production, I'm brought in essentially on a kind of consultancy basis in pre-production and helping with establishing the kind of the color palette, the look, and that gets fed straight into the art department. It's all coming from the director ultimately, and it's all about sort of working to create that vision that they have for the whole film. But putting a look and thinking about how certain colors can make people feel certain ways and can flag up certain things that might be happening, that might be sort of foreshadowing in the story. It might be just kind of making you feel a certain way about a certain character. It's a hugely powerful thing, and I've talked about it a lot through these webinars and other talks I've done over the years. But directing color actually came about because I've done a number of different masterclasses for MZ, and in fact, directing color was the first one that I did for them. And the original plan when I first started working with MZ was to do a very big, comprehensive color grading course, which ultimately became mastering color, which actually was the second course. But I suspect partly because MZ wanted to kind of test the water with little old me, and also just to kind of see what kind of the response was, how much of an appetite there was for this type of thing, because up until that point there hadn't really been any discussion of color and post-production, or very little of it on MZ. And I think the original idea was we were going to do something just about HDR, but we ended up incorporating that into mastering color. And so I had this kind of free reign to kind of choose a topic that wouldn't take too long to cover. I think the directing color course in MZ is only about an hour and a half or 2 hours or something like that. It's not very long. And I kind of got to choose what we covered, and so that the structure that I'm going to be kind of talking to you today is kind of really come from when I was developing that course. And I wanted to highlight and shine a bit of a spotlight on some of the processes that, as I say, occasionally we get to actually do as colorists. We get to be brought in, we get to work with directors and the art department, and really kind of build out a look that's intertwined with everything, because it ends up on screen. It's there, it's in the rushes, rather than just coming along at the end. And it's really dispiriting actually when you're presented with something and just told we want this, and you're looking at the footage and you're looking at the brief, and it's like, well, how are these things? I can kind of force a look into this, but why and how? And so really the whole point of this directing color talk is about thinking about it much, much earlier on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the net result of this. So when we were making this masterclass, we actually had a corporate project that we were doing, that we were kind of batting around anyway. And we decided to kind of use this as the kind of the centerpiece for this whole course. So when we were filming, we essentially did it as a kind of a BTS style, whilst I was shooting a short, online promo for a lovely couple of guys who are private chefs, and they run a company where they will come to you either for like private parties at your house, or quite often if people are renting holiday homes, they'll come and they'll cook and cook it in the kitchen in the place where you are and serve it to you. And it's a really very luxurious, very high caliber product that they're selling. And we wanted to kind of do that justice. And we decided that we would kind of base directing color around this process. We could have used a number of different projects, but this one just kind of seemed to fit the bill quite nicely and came up at the same time. So maybe if I show you the kind of the end result and then work backwards, and we'll rewind right to the very beginning of pre-production on it. So I'm going to share my screen. And he says, let's start off sharing this one. Optimize screen share for a video clip. Sounds good. Let's try that. See what happens. And what's my password? Okay. Hopefully this will work. Hopefully you can hear it as well. All right, Jake?
It looks...
Me and Josh have both kind of got varying tastes. Josh probably a little bit more modern and I'm a bit more traditional. Clean flavours, trying not to overcomplicate things, basically.
We're in Cornwall, we use fish and we try and get sea herbs and things like that are from down here. Inspiration, as much as it comes from looking at different cuisines, it also has to come from where you are in the country.
Big satisfaction part for us is starting off as just a planned dish and an idea, and then you put the plate down on the table and just seeing their reaction, getting that direct feedback. It makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it? That's what we're passionate about.
Drone shot. Okay. Right. So stop that, and then I'm gonna quit QuickTime, and instead I'm gonna share this screen. So hopefully you can now see this screen. Is that appearing okay your end, Jake?
Yeah, all good, mate. Yep.
Lovely. Okay, so let's kind of work backwards then from that end result. So as with anything really in filmmaking, we are always going to be starting from the point of view of fulfilling someone's vision. There'll be normally a brief way involved in, obviously, with corporates, which I've talked about with you before. And in this case, it was kind of actually very much a collaborative thing, because we were trying to do what we were trying to do. They wanted, something that they could use to promote themselves and their business. And it all started with just a conversation, really, as these things often do. When I was talking to them in the early stages, I was talking about, typical what kind of experience that they offer, what are people getting when they essentially kind of commission them. And during the kind of stories that they were telling me about what they've done, there was one that particularly resonated, which was a family who were holidaying down in Cornwall, and they always make big efforts to obviously cook what people want. So obviously they're being hired in, they're going to get given sort of notes about favorite dishes and flavors or things that people don't like that they should avoid using. But they will also try and, if they can, incorporate local ingredients. And partly the name, Oxen Origin, for me, it was a question of, well, where does this name come from? And I think it was Josh, worked as a butcher or trained as a butcher. And the name sort of came about from the meat produce that they were using. They were using this incredible meat from the butchery where he worked, and that's where he kind of branched out from. And the origin, meaning sort of they take a lot of consideration to where their stuff is coming from, where it originates from. And so they were saying how whenever they go, wherever it might be, because they can literally travel all around the world, but they were giving this example of this family they were cooking for down in Cornwall, and they will go down sort of the day before. They will seek out produce that's kind of in season and fresh locally to where they're going to be based, and try and incorporate that into the dish. And I think he was talking about, he says in the film about fresh mackerel and sourcing stuff from nearby. So that kind of said, that sort of meant to me that if we could find a location that kind of demonstrated something quite clearly like that, like local produce. And initially it was kind of, well, let's try and think of meats. They were talking about kind of beef and butchery and that sort of stuff. But in this particular example, they were talking about fish. And I was like, it'd be really nice if we could somehow kind of get down and incorporate the sea and bring that together. So from a color point of view, I had this kind of idea in my mind. It would be really useful if we could be somewhere sort of next to the sea and kind of incorporate those blues. And my initial thoughts were all around kind of like this kind of blue palette. And quite quickly in my search for somewhere that was simply near the coast, I found this place, which you can see on the screen at the moment. And it ticked a number of boxes. First of all, it has this huge windows, curved windows. It's literally nestled into the hillside and has its own private beach, essentially, that you kind of walk down to. And the fact that you can see through the windows to the sea immediately connected the space to the landscape and to the sea. And that kind of origin part of their name kind of really fed into that. And the other thing is, you can just see this just on the left-hand side of the frame. You're just seeing the edge of the worktop for the kitchen, which you also would have obviously seen in the promo itself. And the other thing that was kind of crucial to me was somewhere that was open plan, where the kitchen was kind of part of the space. And this just, this was fantastic. This huge open plan space. You've got the sort of living area here. You can see the dining table behind, and then the kitchen on the left. It all kind of was open plan and worked together, which meant that we can literally connect the experience of them cooking in the kitchen and then serving that on the dining table. So that ticked another big box. Then there's those kind of practical things about what you're trying to do in terms of the video. But then it was like, let's switch gears. Let's think about how we're using color effectively here. How are we kind of creating a palette? How do we make that work with the space that we're in? And how do we make sure that there's nothing else that kind of contradicts that? Because it's all very well thinking, I want this color palette, I want this look, these are the colors I want to use in the film. But things come along and shit happens, and suddenly you realize that someone's changed all of the covers. This was one of the images that was actually from the location agency's website. For all we know, we could have got there and found that they'd put sort of bright, vivid purple carpets down, or there's any number of things that kind of just happen. So you've got to start with an intention, but then you've also got to kind of be responsive and react to when things kind of don't quite work that way, and take control of those. Try and mitigate them if you can in advance. One of the things that was really important was that any color palette that we established didn't clash or was somehow kind of reduced by the colors of the objects in the space. So two massive plus points for this space were the fact that the dining table, the chairs, the sofas and the floor are all grey. They're really dark, sort of slate grey. And in fact, the floor had this very slight blue in it, very, very slight. And certainly any greys, dark greys, slate kind of colors really take blue very nicely in terms of color grading. You can push kind of blue into them quite happily. The second thing that was a huge tick was that the kitchen was white. The white kitchen was quite an important point. It didn't have to be white, but it would have been ideal if it had been white. So again, seeing this space was like, oh my God, there's tick, 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 tick. The white kitchen, when you're shooting people in kitchen spaces, and we've got a fair amount of experience from doing this with other customers as well. I think I've mentioned before, we do an awful lot of food and beverage stuff. If you have a white kitchen, then everything you put in it, in fact, not just kitchen, if you have a white space, if you have a grey space, if you have anything that's neutral, the colours that you then put in it really stand out because there's nothing else to compete with them. Now, you want to be careful that you don't end up creating something that's flat and boring, but you then equally don't want to have anything that's competing and drawing the viewer's eye away from where you want to be looking. So in terms of the ingredients and the people, the wardrobe and the people, the talent in this case, which was our chefs, by having a white kitchen, it draws attention to them, the things that are important, them and the ingredients that they're using, and you're not distracted by the space that's around them. A really good example of where this can not work was a Primula TV ad that I was grading a while ago, and it was an ITV Studios production. I was doing the grade for them, and it was fine. It was the pretty typical kind of squeezy cheese ads that you've seen before. There's a family and they're cooking, and he's like making like a pasta bake or something. He puts the food down, and his kids are like, "Oh, lovely." Pretty standard fare, but one of the things that that was kind of part of the brief when I got the job, and was part of the kind of the feedback throughout that, was to try and make the father who was cooking the food, try and get him to stand out. And the set that they had used, the kitchen where he's cooking, it's all pine cabinets. There's just wood everywhere, and right in the middle of it, you've got this human being with skin, and wood and skin are very, very close, almost identical on a vector scope. So in terms of losing our talent, it really, really made things very difficult. I had to try and knock back the saturation of the cabinets and try and sort of amp him up a bit, but not to the point where he looked like an Oompa Loompa. It was really, really tricky to get that balance right. And if only they had used a different coloured kitchen, there wouldn't have been anywhere near like those problems. So it's one of those things that, in this case, it's a kitchen and people cooking, but whatever the project is that you're making, you need to think about, establish your palette first, establish what you're trying to do and why. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But then also make sure that you have things that complement that around it, so that everything about your location or your set or wherever it is that you're working is kind of moving in that direction, or at least having the good grace to kind of be neutral and stay out the way and allow those other things to come through. If you start taking an idea of a palette, maybe it's in your wardrobe, or maybe it's in your makeup, or maybe it's some other thing, or props or something, and you put those in a space that then either match those so closely that you lose the impact of them or clash with them, then it's an own goal. You can't move forward from that. You're kind of stuck. And bearing in mind that all it takes is an idea of what you're trying to achieve, and then searching for what hits that criteria, that's kind of all you're after. It's a little bit like choosing music. And I do often compare audio choices and music choices to color grading. There's a lot of similarities, actually. This idea of choosing something that emotionally resonates, that grounds someone, that helps tell the story as well as the dialogue and the action on screen. They're very, very similar. They share a lot of similar ideals and similar kind of approaches to filmmaking. And I guess it's similar in a sense to kind of choosing music for your film. Sometimes something just pops up straight away, and you just, yeah, that's the one. That's the piece of music that I see this film fitting around. And sometimes you have to really struggle. Sometimes it takes you a very long time before you find the right thing. And it's a little bit like that in this case. We got really lucky. I think this was only the second or third location that we were looking at that just fit the bill perfectly. It was our score, if you like, this location. It's absolutely underpinned everything that we did, and it just worked. But it's not always that case. We've all been there when we've been trying to find music, and you're just there and hours go by and you just can't find the right one. It's exactly the same thing when we're trying to think about locations. We're trying to fit something in. We're trying to find something that will tick all the boxes that we need and hit just the right notes. So we got really, really lucky with this. And the white kitchen, seeing out through to the sea, the lovely natural light. It's also, it stands out. It's not your everyday kind of domestic property. It's something that looks visually interesting and exciting. And the fireplace is super awesome as well. I don't know if you can see that on the right hand side, but the suspended fireplace was just so cool. And in fact, that fireplace and this image was one of the first things that got me thinking about fleshing out what had just started from this simple idea of blue, the sea. I was thinking of the mackerel. In fact, there's a shot in the final promo where he puts the mackerel down just before he flames the skin. And I've graded that to really bring out the blues. Just that whole promo was shot on Canon C200 in 12-bit RAW, so huge amounts of color information there. And in fact, that fish was far more subtle, sort of silvery blue. But I really, really wanted it. It was one of the kind of key images I had in my mind right from those early conversations with the guys. So I really sort of brought out as much of that blue as possible and got him to kind of slide it in front of the camera. So I wanted to connect those blues to something, but until I saw this image, actually, it hadn't really kind of struck me. So the fireplace and the fire here and those warm kind of homely kind of colors, I thought were something that was relevant. It was relevant going back to the Oxen Origin name. They were talking an awful lot when they were talking about how they started out and their backgrounds and where the name came from, about produce and about good butchery, free range, organic produce, well cared for beef and pork and wild fish and all these other sorts of things. And everything they were sort of talking about brought to mind these kind of earthy colors, like vegetables growing in soil, and it was just something that kind of felt like in the same way as, again, back in the same way that a piece of music can, it just seems to kind of just fall in. It feels like it's part of the story. And the sea was the thing that kind of got me thinking down this line of the location. But then what's really lovely about that is these blues, these kind of tealy blues that we have in the sky and the sea. Obviously, it's done to death, orange and teal, but there's a reason why it's so popular. They sit opposite each other on the color wheel. These warm orange colors are skin tones. Obviously, the sky. It is a classic color combination. They're complementary to each other. They balance each other out because they sit directly opposite each other on the color wheel, and they are dominant colors in our everyday life. The sky and skin color, they're things that we see all the time. And because they sit opposite on the color wheel, you can have a good chunk of the image occupying those two areas, and they feel balanced. It feels sort of harmonious. And so when I saw this image and saw the fire, that was my first kind of, maybe we should think to kind of push this idea, this orange and teal look, and start to kind of develop that. And I didn't want that to be something that got forced in the grade. I think people generally acknowledge that Transformers is one of the worst offenders when it comes to a heavily post-production orange and teal look. You see some of the frame grabs from some of those films, and it's like, there's nothing natural about it. It's very forced. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like Hugo. Hugo is a wonderful example of how orange and teal works so well. It absolutely flows into the story. In fact, let me see if I can bring up some. I think you're only seeing my preview window at the moment. Let me see if I can quickly bring up a still from Hugo, just in case. Hugo, Scorsese, of course. Let's get an image up of this just to show you whilst I'm talking about it. Here we go. This will do nicely. Stick that there. Yeah, stick him in there as well. Yeah, so here you go. In that cover there, let's get rid of that. I'm just going to open these up in preview so you can see them at the same time as the other ones. Where's preview gone? There it is. So hopefully you can see these. Oh, that's very low quality. Oh, I've grabbed the thumbnails. What an idiot. Okay. These are going to be tiny on your screen. Sorry. Let me stop that and share this one. Sorry, guys. These are absolutely tiny because I've stupidly grabbed the thumbnails. But if you've not seen Hugo, there you go. Look at that pixelated Hugo. We're only looking at the colors, so it doesn't matter. If you haven't seen Hugo, it's a really incredible film when you get to this kind of idea of color palettes and how they're integrated into the art direction of the film. There's literally nothing in this film that isn't orange or teal. From the stripy blue, orange and teal jumper of the young actor in the film, to the cyan that's pushed into the wardrobe with an awful lot of the actor Sacha Baron Cohen, who's the kind of like the villain in the film. He's always dressed head to toe in this incredibly vivid cyan sort of policeman's outfit. And the whole film, if you've not seen it, is about this boy's relationship to his father who's died, and this this kind of maquette, this metallic object, is kind of almost like robotic object that that he thinks is imbued with his father's spirit. And the whole film plays on the idea of this kind of metallic, very cool, inanimate object that he feels contains his father's soul, and it uses very beautifully these warm colors, these humanity kind of comes through the oranges, and then the cool kind of robotic, and they balance each other off, and it's just used wonderfully. The way that it's kind of embedded into the film is just it's just insane, really. It's a level that most people would never even dream of going to. So if you haven't seen Hugo, go and see it, and seek it out because it's fantastic. So where you've got kind of, on one end of the spectrum, you've got a look that's kind of forced in, and then you've got on the other end of the spectrum a look that's kind of just there. It's on screen anyway. Definitely what we're talking about is the latter here. So in terms of the space that we had here, I started kind of thinking, well, how can we incorporate these earthy colors, these orangey, more warm, earthy colors in? We've got the fire here, but what I didn't realize until I kind of flicked over to another image, and I'm going to see if I can find. Hang on. Oh, that was another thing. So I started flicking through the images. This is actually a still from some of the BTS stuff that we did, and I don't have the original location images other than this one. But as soon as I started looking around, you can just see there's some lamps hanging above the dining room table over there, and dotted throughout this space were these copper lines, these sort of panel beaten copper lined light fixtures. And I was like, okay, so now we've got the fire and we've got these oranges as well. Maybe it's just enough to maybe start to pull this look together. And then the big one, which you can just see in the background here, was there's this massive, absolutely staggeringly large central stone wall that runs through the middle of the whole space. and it's the only sort of traditional building material that's used in the whole building. Everything else is very contemporary, very minimalist, glass and metal, and this big, deep umber reddy brown wall. And as soon as I saw that image, I just knew, well, there's the balance that we need. You can literally see, although you can't in this particular image because it's clipped, but you could see through from the warm, deep, earthy orange colors of this wall. You could see straight through and out to the sea, outside, and there was that color palette. And so I knew I had enough balance then with these other bits and pieces to kind of pull this together. So the next thing then was, well, how can we kind of develop that in terms of our talent, where we're going to be looking? So there's two things that we did. The first was making sure that any clothing that they were wearing was going to fall within this palette. So we got both of them to wear white shirts, and then we found they told me where they get their aprons from, and we ordered some aprons. I think the aprons they normally wore were blue, which kind of could have worked, but I was worried about there being too much blue because we were going to have so much coming in from the sea, and also pushing in some cool blue into the slate and in the dining table and stuff. So I was worried there would be too much. So actually, I got them to bring them, but then we also ordered some brown aprons as well. So we kind of had these lovely deep brown, which would pick up with the wall, and even things like the wooden chopping board, obviously their skin. And then this isn't Josh, this is the other chap whose name I've forgotten, which I'm sorry about. But he said he always wears beanies. He's got tons of beanies. I was like, would you have any orange or brown beanies? And he said, oh, I've got an orange one. I was like, bring that. So, low scale here, but kind of essentially manipulating the wardrobe here to make sure that we kind of fitted within this particular color palette that we're trying to develop. And sometimes it's a case of kind of planning these things, like the wardrobe choices here, but sometimes it's a case of just reacting to what's around. So one of the bags that they brought some of their ingredients in was this blue bag, which you can see here. They also brought some things that kind of didn't fit, like there's a green chopping board, and there was a couple of kind of green handled knives and stuff that I think that they used, which we had no other choice but to have. So that was about in post, then just dialing back those colors. But here, because I knew that I couldn't contain the bright sunshine outside and the talent. So what we ended up doing was letting the outside go, letting it clip, and then introducing just a little bit of that blue elsewhere. So just kind of, it was just next to him anyway. We just kind of pushed it into the frame a bit, just to kind of let that balance out. We've got the blue in the image, in the artwork that's hung on the wall. Actually, a lot of his tattoos were kind of within those kind of blue palettes as well. So we felt like that was probably just enough just to kind of balance out the frame. So we were kind of conscious all the way through to have a bit of a rhythm to the color palette. Let me come forward here. So in terms of the blues, as I said, we knew we always had the sea outside if we needed to kind of bring that color, that blue in, but then also pushing in these blues into the slate, into the dark grays, and using that to kind of balance out with the candlelight. We've got some nice warm kind of tungsten overheads here as well, just to kind of balance that out to the white plates, which are warm. All of these things, the color of the candles, everything was kind of there deliberately because it would fall within a certain palette. The cutlery we chose, the napkins we chose, the plates we chose. And this was kind of nice because at this point of the day, and we had to hit this time. So we only had one chance to get this all right. These guys are genuinely cooking a 3-course meal, which the crew thoroughly enjoyed. As I'm sure you can imagine. So literally, like, we filmed them kind of plating it up and putting it down the table, and then we would cut, go and eat it, clear down, and then film the rest of the next bits, and then plating up the next course, and then we'd all eat it. It was a tough gig. What can I say? But we knew that we had to hit a certain point where it was just at the end, so just at the transitionary point between sort of golden hour and blue hour. So just as the sun had gone down below the horizon at the very start of blue hour, we wanted those warm blues to come in, because we knew that then the sort of the practicals, if you like, with the fire and with the tungsten lights would then bring that balance in. And so constant the whole day was like, we need to hit this particular time. It was scheduled to within an inch of its life, because of the color, because the color was the most important point in the whole piece. Now, separately, actually, and a lot of this stuff you wouldn't have seen. This is some of the stuff that was just shot as B-roll, as part of the wider behind the scenes that form the basis of the directing color masterclass for MZ. And it's quite fun actually when you start kind of looking for color palettes. It's something that you you kind of get to the point where you can't not see it, and it's a really nice place, I think, to be in. If you get to the stage, if you're thinking about color and you start to kind of see combinations all the time, and this is just a simple example. This dog just kind of fit perfectly into our color palette with the blue, the teal blue collar, and then the kind of the sandy colored fur on the beach with the background. This is one of those just happy kind of things. But it was really nice actually. We shot the promo over one day, but we were actually there for I think the place was booked for like 5 days, so we were filming the piece to camera and everything that kind of went into the actual course and all of the B-roll. But it was really nice to kind of go out looking for what we knew. It's not quite the same as just turning up and hoping, because we were there because it hit our color palette. We were there, and the whole thing stemmed from this combination. So it's interesting, once you kind of make those decisions early on, they generally mean you end up in the right place. You find things that fit your palette because you're already in the right space. So it kind of leaves these kind of happy accidents to happen. So this was one of them. And we've got some nice stuff with the drone. And I should point out, this is all the graded stuff. So, for example, the collar, I can't remember if it did, but if it was blue but wasn't quite the right blue, or even if it was purple, because we were shooting in 12-bit RAW with the C200, there was a huge amount of color data to do that kind of that fix it in post. Now, fix it in post, as hopefully all of you know, is never a solution. But if you've moved yourself into a place where your color management, your codec choice, your camera choice, your lighting, your art direction, wardrobe, and everything, if you've moved your whole production into a space where those things can really come to the fore, it leaves some wiggle room for you to kind of push things. So let's say, for example, this was a green or a purple collar, and we were like, we can actually move that. We can actually push that round in post-production using a simple hue versus hue curve to actually get that to fall within our palette. And there are loads of examples of that. This orange, it's this was a copper lined light, but there was a little bit too much red. It didn't quite fit the palette that we were doing. So when I was color grading the promo, I'm literally going through, looking at the vector scope and making sure that there's a very small sort of harmonious range of oranges, and we're not letting things get too red or too yellow at any point. So this isn't a coppery red. This is a slightly augmented, hyper real version of what copper look is, far more golden than it really was. And the same with the dog collar potentially, or the sea, or whatever it might be. You're pushing them through to a range. And I've already talked about this shot here with the mackerel and the skin. It was much duller than this in real life, and I was a bit disappointed. It's like, this fish isn't blue enough, and they're like, well, sorry about that. But again, because of the integrity of the codec, because we had the space, we planned for something. It didn't quite go the way we thought, but we had the wiggle room in post to push that up. It's not the same as if he turned up with salmon, and it was bright pink, and we're like, that doesn't fit what we're trying to do. This was a fish that was chosen because it fit within what we're trying to do. And in fact, all the ingredients were very carefully chosen. The entire menu Whereas they were used to having people saying, oh, well, this is my favorite dish, and I don't like mushrooms and don't do this. We were going to them saying, well, look, let's make something with butternut squash. Let's make stuff with, let's use fish. Let's use mackerel for the skin color. Let's try and push in these colors. And, the dessert, each course was chosen and kind of orbiting around a certain color palette and a certain color choice. We have to also understand that there are times where we want a certain color just to really stand out, because over time, if you're too strict with a color palette, or if you try and make a color palette work over an entire piece, if it's a short piece, it's fine. But if you're trying to do it over a longer piece, you can become sort of fatigued with it, and you start to kind of forget about it, and it doesn't kind of have that resonance. It doesn't have the impact. So what you can start to do is maybe sort of pick a third color in this case, or fourth, or whatever you're trying to do with your palette, but something that kind of fits close enough, but maybe just stands out enough. And one of the things that you find with orange and teal is that if you have orange and teal, if you go off at a kind of a triadic tangent, you get magenta. And a triadic color palette is actually quite challenging, and it really makes sort of people take note. Joker is a fantastic example of a film that uses, particularly in the second half of the film, uses a triadic color scheme to kind of really make things pop off the screen. And because magenta is triadic to orange and teal, it was something that we kind of just introduced at the end, actually, to really connect the whole thing to the food. And we tied that section to when they're talking about the reason they love it is that direct connection with the person that's eating their food. It starts with this idea, and then it gets to the point where you're putting it on a plate in front of them and they're saying that they love it. And that was something that really resonated when I was talking to them in the brief, because they loved that connection to the experience that their diners were having, that was lost when they were just chefing in restaurants, because they were back in the kitchen and they never got to really hear or see the kind of the pleasure and the positive results of their food. So that was quite a crucial scene. It happens at quite a crucial piece of dialogue, and so we used the poached rhubarb to give us that magenta kick that kind of brings that whole piece together. This is another example of kind of happenstance, the palette, but the wood here has been worked on fairly heavily. The wood didn't quite give me the balance that I wanted. Overall, we wanted a relatively subdued. We didn't want this to be punchy. We wanted it to be earthy. We wanted it to feel slightly kind of timeless in a way. I didn't want it to feel too commercially stylized. So the whole piece is relatively subdued saturation. And the wood here, obviously, you've got the great sign there, to the beach, which I think from memory was actually hung up inside the house, and I think we moved it to the fence here to kind of really draw these two things in, pointing to the sea, spoon feeding the audience here. But I remember I did pull back the saturation in that fence paneling to allow that sign to really stand out, because I didn't want to then just amp up the saturation of the signage, because it wouldn't fit the overall tonal aesthetic that we're setting. So sometimes taking away is far more important than pushing. And again, very similar to music. If you've got too much if you've got too much of a certain frequency in music, it's best to attenuate those other frequencies. Or if you want more treble, then attenuate the bass. So if you want more bass, then attenuate the treble. So taking away to allow other things to stand out, rather than just pushing up the thing that you want. It's a common practice in audio as well. It means that you're never artificially ramping up something. And if you go back to that example I gave before about the Primula ad, with the guys, the father cooking with the pine cabinets behind him, the client kept saying increase the saturation of his skin, but much better to pull back the saturation of the cabinets, of the wood around him, to allow him to look natural and not sort of overly saturated. So this was a similar example of where that was done. We use blood orange. This rapeseed oil has been moved into frame to give a little bit of suggestion of the color palette within the frame. We've got the browns, we've got the skin, and this blood orange was quite a nice section of it. And another example of this kind of pushing around in post, just to kind of fit a certain thing. I noticed, had no idea in advance, I noticed that one of the guys had this orange skull tattoo on his arm, and with the blue bits, and I was like, well, I'm not going to miss that opportunity. So was filming it, and when he got back into post, actually, it was quite a yellowy orange, and it didn't quite fit with the colours of these orange peels. So the where they appeared next to each other in the frame, I've literally sampled where the orange peel fell on the vectorscope, and then I've used a hue versus hue curve to actually pull this round so it fit in the same space. So again, you're open to that manipulation. That's fine if it means that you can augment something that to kind of fall in there. Here's the magenta. So we've got the magenta from the rhubarb, just helping with what's otherwise a relatively subdued scene, just to kind of add in a new color, triadic color that kind of pops it off the screen. Again, the sand was a useful one. The rock, so the rock that's used, in fact, the local stone that's used for the big wall in the building itself, is sort of from the side of the hill, and they kind of like these rocks are sort of tumbling down and into the sea, and there's a few of them, as you can see here, that just sort of jut up out of the water. And this again was just one of those scenes where it just fell together. It just kind of worked really, really well. And in fact, whilst I was down shooting some of this stuff, there was a guy, a detectorist down on the beach, who was he very thoughtfully of him, he had turned up in this red jumper that was almost exactly the same color as this stone, and he had black motorcycle trousers on. He literally rocked up on his motorbike, got off, grabbed a metal detector off the back of his bike, and he just went down, and he was sweeping along the beach. And I actually just filmed him for a little while and just kind of cut together actually this little separate piece. It ended up not really working in the BTS or the promo or anything, but it was just such a nice little scene, and it graded beautifully. The really big 12-bit codec with the raw file. We really teased out this beautifully kind of subtle, earthy colors, but really just worked. It was lovely. It was a nice palette. So I actually cut together a little sort of separate piece called the Detectorist, which I think is up on my Vimeo. So finding those colors and bringing them in is so important. So when you kind of put this level of thought into your production, and you're trying to bring this cohesion together with the color, it would be a massive own goal if you then didn't ensure that there was that color management in terms of your production. So color management becomes even more important. I mean, it's always vital, but it's even more important when you've put this level of thought into the way that colors appear on screen. If you're looking at it with your eye, you've chosen wardrobe, you've chosen location because your eye tells you that these things work together, and then you trip yourself up by pointing the camera at that and not thinking about color management. It would be a big problem. So simple things in color management, simple things like you see here, I'm using the X-Rite color checker chart to just make sure that we've got the accurate representation of the colors that we're seeing in front of the camera. Simple steps like properly white balancing, taking charts so that when you're back in post-production, you've got an authentic, realistic interpretation of the colors that were there on the day. This particular shot is from the interview that we did with them. So in fact, we ended up not using any of the visuals from this. We just used the dialogue as a voiceover. But you can see my C200 there, rigged up for shoulder. We had it on the shoulder more or less the whole time, with all the B-roll, and then just plonked it on the sticks for for this interview using Canon Cine Primes. So the whole thing was shot on, I think it was the three main lenses that we used were the CNE 35mm, 50mm, and I think it's the 50mm that we've got on the camera here. And then a lot of the B-roll down on the beach and around and about was either shot on the 2470 f2.8 Mark II, it would have been, and the 100 to 400mm Canon EF which is like an F4, I think, or something like that, which is a hell of a lens, I have to say. So that detectorist piece, actually, if you do go look at our Vimeo, vimeo.com/Coro Films, that detectorist video is entirely shot on that 400mm on the long end of that lens. It's pin sharp. It's incredible, that lens. So using the charts, we were able to make sure that this kind of all worked. You can see the wall in the background there. We've got the sea in. We've got all the kind of the earthy colours that we kind of wanted. That palette's really come to life. We ended up not using the visuals from this, but there you go. That's production. This was actually the piece to camera from from the directing colour masterclass. This was my piece to camera for that, which was filmed the day after those guys had done all their thing and kind of gone. So they were there for us with the day. This is the following day, and that whole piece to camera is just done as a talking head. Excuse me, as a talking head, symmetrical framing, and the light was quite different actually this next day. It was much warmer, and it actually altered the color of the wall behind. But because the actual promo wasn't part of the masterclass, it's just something that you can watch it at the end if you want to, but it's about everything that went into that production. It actually didn't matter so much that actually that color had shifted around a bit. But again, just using simple color management, this is obviously the ungraded frame, using the charts to make sure that those colors work. I've obviously chosen my favorite orange wool jumper here to make sure that I stayed within color palettes. Really making sure that everything kind of tied together, even with the BTS and with the course itself. Manually white balancing, recording these charts. The other thing was making sure that we were using decent calibrated reference monitors on location, making sure that what we were seeing was what we were getting, even in fact what we did on some of the shots here, which were particularly relevant to this stuff at the end where they've served the food. Let's come back to this shot. I wanted to check that this would work. This was quite a delicate balancing act. So actually what we did is we loaded up earlier in the day, and we did a test the day before as well, I think, filmed a chart in here, took that chart shot into my laptop, into Resolve, and created a very gentle, kind of did a primary balance, but then also just gently pushed some blue into the shadows, because I wanted to just check that it was going to look the way that I thought it was going to look. And I didn't want to have to kind of rely on a look that wasn't going to be able to be achieved. So just quickly did that in Resolve, right-clicked on the thumbnail in Resolve, exported that as a LUT, loaded that LUT up into, let's go back, into our on-set monitoring. This is a Atomos Sumo we were using here, and loading that LUT in so that when we were filming all of that stuff, we could actually see the look that we were moving towards sort of there in place, and we could check that it kind of felt right. And obviously we can disable that LUT. It wasn't being burnt into anything. We're just monitoring with that LUT just to make sure. So that's another thing that you can do when you're trying to get a certain aesthetic, particularly if that aesthetic you think is going to come mainly from a stylized grade. You can actually start to move in that direction and generate your own show LUT or program LUT from that to load into the monitors, load into your camera, and see whilst you're recording the way that you're going to be moving, which is obviously really useful for visualizing that look whilst you're there on location or on set.
Ollie, you should, in Zoom, can you see the Q&A in the chat section down the bottom?
Let me grab it open. Hang on. Hang on. Chat. There we go. It's in a different window. I can't see any chats though.
No, the chat or the Q&A, you can't see either. Let me have a look.
No.
So it's three questions from Wayne. Where was your white balance here? How would you set your white balance on this?
Oh, hang on. Sorry, no, I can see it now. Now I've stopped screen sharing. I can see it. Yeah. Wayne Mansell, where was your white balance here? That was 20 minutes ago. I'm not sure which scene you were referring to, Wayne. But to be honest, it's academic because I'm never going to remember. We would have white balanced for each scene that we were in. And taken a reference and manually white balanced using a grey card. So I don't remember exactly. I'm not the type of person that just flicks my camera to 3200 or 5600 and leaves it like that. We tend to want every scene to be neutral, unless we're deliberately shooting off temperature. This wasn't one of those times, but if we were deliberately shooting off temperature, obviously we wouldn't do that. But something like this, where there's huge amounts of natural light coming in, and we want the whites of their shirt to be neutral, so that all of the colors of the objects that are on them and around them to kind of be where they're meant to be. That's actually, we would have manually white balanced from each different sort of scene that we were shooting. So yes, no, we didn't intend to shoot off color is the answer to that one. So I suspect that the scene that you were talking about when you asked that question was that transitionary point from golden hour into blue hour. And in fact, we would have actually rated the camera at 5600 for that. So I'm actually lying. So for that particular scene, you wouldn't, or I wouldn't ever manually white balance from anything once you get towards that golden hour and into blue hour. If you'll find that you completely counterbalance the scattering of the light through the atmosphere that's doing what it's meant to be doing. So actually, you are better off in those particular instances just rating the camera at daylight and letting those colors be what they are. So yeah, if that's what you meant. Oh, there you go. Yes, that is what you meant. Good. Watch what you showed. Yeah. Cool. Hopefully I've answered that for you, Wayne. Let me just scroll down here. What about continuity as you get later? Well, the scenes were quite separate. So continuity is a good point, but your continuity, you've got to relate it always back to the scene. The scene was changing. Through the vast majority of daylight hours, the color temperature is pretty, I mean, it's varying because it's always varying, but let's say it's a cloudless day, and in fact it was the whole time we were filming there. Incidentally, just as an anecdote, the whole week that we were down there, this was February 2018, I think I'm right in saying, the whole week that we were there, it was absolutely glorious sunshine. You could easily have been sort of deceived into thinking it was June or July. It was baking hot, it was beautiful, clear skies. And I don't know if you remember, but that 2018 February, that was when we had that terrible snowstorms that were the following week. It was really weird. We spent this whole week in this amazing place, amazing weather on the beach, and the following week it was absolute whiteout across the whole country. It was very, very bizarre. Anyway, I digress. For the vast majority of the day, really sort of, at this time of year, for example, I mean, then it being February, it was much, much narrower, but at this time of year being June, obviously you've got the biggest number of hours where it's fairly consistent. And so you might white balance if you've changed setup and keep it, but it's going to be fairly consistent on a cloudless day. But as soon as you start to get to those sort of last 3 hours of daylight, that's when I start being a little bit more conscious. If I'm doing stuff that's meant to tie in with what we've done earlier, I would be far more conscious about white balancing there. But then there's a point where you get to this tipping point where you want that light to be prominent. You want those those golden hour colors to really come through, and that's when we just kind of default right back to 5600. As I said before, that becomes much more manageable when you're shooting raw anyway, because obviously you can change that in post if you needed to. Also, one would presume that you've planned your shoot so that it's the scene that you want at that time is at that time. It's not typical that you would plan to shoot something at, say, at this time of year, where the sun's setting at kind of 9 o'clock. It's not typical that you would, unless something's gone seriously wrong, that you had planned to shoot a scene that was, at sort of 7 o'clock, and you were done at 8, and then you had a separate golden hour scene that you were going to film, it's too close together that there wouldn't be enough distinction between it. So it depends on the narrative. Obviously, I'm being very broad here, but you would probably have a distinctly separate golden hour scene, just like we did here. We had them cooking throughout the day, and we were timing it so that the point where the main course was finished, we had finished filming all of the stuff of them cooking, and we had done the interview, and then we were just getting the stuff of them putting the food down, plating up and stuff. So that hopefully should mean you shouldn't have a continuity problem. But how do you use the X-Rite chart in a practical sense? That's from Alfie. Sorry, I'm distracted by Wayne's point at the end there. How do you use the X-Rite chart in a practical sense? Right. The X-Rite color checker video target, one side is a white balance side. You use that to white balance your camera. And the other side is, there's big chips in the middle. In fact, I've got one behind me. Here we go. There you go. I've got a really big one. This is an extra big one. I have to move back. These ones are used for like drones and when you can't get the camera close to the chart. So these are really big. This is the extra large. So you've got these white chips and grey chips and a glossy black in the middle. You use those to check your exposure. I've done a number of talks about this actually, Alfie, for CVP. So you might want to kind of dive into this a bit deeper. You might want to go back onto YouTube, on CVP's YouTube channel, and look at, I can't remember which one, probably Mastering Color. But I seem to get onto the subject all the time, and I'm an ambassador for X-Rite, so I seem to constantly be. That's not why I talk about them all the time. I just use them all the time because they're so good. But I've gone in a lot more detail about how to use them. But essentially, you can use these to set your exposure correctly. So, for example, the white chip is a 90% reflectance. The next one down is a middle grey. So you can use those to expose, and that's fairly well documented how you can use 90% reflectance and 18% greys, which are about 45% reflectance for exposure. And then you just, so you can, that's actually helping you practically in production. You're actually setting the camera's exposure based on that. And then if you just capture a few seconds of it, you can then take that image into post, and there's a whole workflow that you can use. Well, there's two workflows. There's an automated workflow where you line up a chart and press a button, and it almost always never works. And then there's a manual technique, which I use, where you use hue versus hue and hue versus sat curves to place the chromaticity coordinates. So here we've got saturated and desaturated chromaticity coordinates for Rec 709. So you've got the primary and secondary references that line up exactly with the chromaticity references for Rec 709 on the vector scope. And you can use the hue versus hue to get the angle where you want them, and then the saturation to place them in the boxes. So that shot I showed you at the end with me holding the chart and it's ungraded and graded. The graded version, I've done exactly that. I've placed all those boxes, placed the white point and the black point, and it's a very, it's slower than, just pressing a button and hoping for the best. But it works every single time. It will give you a perfectly exposed and color balanced image. And in terms of starting point for a grade, it's absolutely rock solid. So Wayne, chasing the blue, no, we definitely don't want to chase the blue, because if you're chasing the blue at that time of day, you're basically going to end up with something that just looks black and white. It'll lose all of its tone. I will look into it deeper. Thanks, Ollie, for that. Subliminal messaging, conveniently leaving an extra large X-ray in the background. Yes, it's a prop. It's let me pull it back. It does genuinely live there. I actually keep it there. I never used to, but I've started keeping it there since I've been doing these webinars, because it's really useful for my camera. So I'm filming this with my C200. My C200 is quite far on the other side of the room with an 85mm lens on, and I've got the screen rotated round. And with the large chips, I can actually see, and I can peek around it, and I can check that I'm exposing the camera correctly from over there. So that's why it's behind me at the moment. Also, potentially subliminal messaging. Who knows? I'm not being paid by X-Rite, so there's nothing in it for me. Alfie. So hopefully that proves that I've not done that deliberately. Okay, Jake. So those Q&As are coming through Zoom. If we had any questions come in from YouTube or Discord, actually, I have to check Discord myself.
There's a few. So when you go for a Kodak stock look, what do you get? What do you do to get the colors of the film? Create it yourself? Use the LUT from someone else? Shoot some tests?
Well, I'll let you into a secret. Whoever asked that question, I am not. And the internet might blow up at this point. I'm not a big fan of film looks. Maybe it's my age. I don't know. I've got a lot of wonderful friends who are younger than me, who cannot get enough of film looks. And I part of me wonders if that's because they didn't have the pain of growing up in a time when that's all we had. I don't know. I'm just not a big fan of film looks. Also, obviously, I run a corporate film production company. There'd have to be a very specific kind of need. A lot of friends I have who shoot film, or if they shoot digital, work heavily to kind of reproduce those Kodak kind of film looks. They do it, fantastically well, absolutely fantastically well. My good friend Jamie Harding is an absolute master of that, but mainly works in music videos, and I think that kind of music video world is really, really ripe and heavily kind of working with those kind of aesthetics at the moment. And it's just not something that I do. It's just not something that we work on. And plus, as I say, it's not something that I'm hugely into. I appreciate it when it's done. Funnily enough, my wife was watching is it the Durrells, I think it's called, a TV series, which I've never actually seen. I've heard of it. I've never actually seen it before, but she was watching it the other night, and I kind of tuned in, and not my cup of tea really, but the film look, the Kodak film look that they had kind of gone for was wonderful, really done very, very nicely actually. So I appreciate it from afar, but it's not something that I typically do. Having said that, on the odd occasion when I have done that, I've used Film Convert, and I've loaded in the profile for the camera we're using, chosen the film stock that we're using or we're trying to emulate. I did a music video. In fact, the music video that I did features in a chapter about creative looks, and a section of that where we look at film, because I know there's a lot of people that like to do film emulation. And we used Film Convert and used the one and only music video I've ever done with a film emulation applied to it, which was shot, half the music video was shot on Arri S16, and the other half was shot on an Alexa or an Amira. I think it might have been an Amira, and applying film emulation to the Amira stuff to get it to match and create kind of like a harmony across the whole thing. It's lovely what it does to the reds. We pushed a lot of cyan into the whites for that. It's a very distinctive look, and we used Film Convert to do that. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, but I'm really, really bad. If you want to really get into film stock emulation, there's two guys that I would seek out and kind of look at their work and ask them those questions. So one is Toby Tompkins at Cheat, a London colour studio. Toby's a fantastically talented colorist, really top of his game. He graded the End of the Fucking World season 1 and season 2, the Netflix series. He's got a huge pedigree. He was creating film emulation LUTs at his studio before like anyone else years and years ago. He's a really good guy to talk to and look at his work. And the other one, a local chap based in Bristol, who's a really fantastically talented colorist, is a guy called Dan Moran. He works a lot with Jamie actually, and with others, and his thing is like film emulation. Like he's got that done to a T. But I know enough to be dangerous. I dabble in a little bit of fake halation every now and again, but it's I leave that to other people to kind of make that take that to the extreme. So hopefully you got something useful out of that answer, whoever it was that asked that. Who was it that asked the question? Jakey. Who was that?
I am mute. I thought I was not muted, but I was muted. Apologies. So it was Tom Samuel, and he's asked another 2 questions as well.
Okay.
What do you think about the ISO CG279X, which I know is a very specific question. I don't know whether you've used it or not.
Hang on, I did that classic male thing of trying to read someone's question and listen at the same time and failing miserably. Hang on, I think it was all about fine. Okay. Ask that question again for me.
So he's asking about the ISO CG279X and whether it's any good, which obviously I know is a very specific question.
It is a very specific question. I can give him a very specific answer. Yes, it's quite good. Yeah, it's those X range of ISO ones are pretty damn good. We touched on this actually last week. I've just got the Asus ProArt 3.2 UCX, and that's an incredible monitor at an incredible price. I would probably throw that into the mix, Tom, and have a look at that one. But yeah, the ISOs, you can't go that wrong with the ISOs. The ISOs for a long time were, really good mid-tier, solid reference monitor. I do feel like, and we mentioned this, I do feel like there are other brands now, like Asus and others, that are kind of coming out with products that I think are kind of better and cheaper. So, it's an exciting time to be thinking about monitoring. There's a lot going on at the moment. You've got things like, if you're using a Mac, you've got things like the Apple Pro Display XDR, another incredible monitor. Not huge fan of it. I actually had one and took it back because there's quite an obvious color shift depending on your angle of view, which kind of rendered it useless for me from a coloring point of view. Depends what kind of level you're going at. Really, I have to say, Canon's DP range of reference monitors are incredible, but they are, much more expensive than an ISO. So I suspect you probably don't have the budget for that if you're looking at the 2.7. But yeah, it's a good monitor. Any other questions? Are you on mute again, Jake?
Oh, for God's sake, man. So, and there's also another question. Any cheap alternatives to Kalman, which I believe is color calibration software?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. There's an open source one called DisplayCal, which again, it's almost like I'm being fed these questions deliberately, but I promise this isn't rehearsed. In my Mastering Color course, on MZ, there is a whole section, I think it may even be in the first lesson, which in fact, I shouldn't be saying this, but I think you can watch for free. And I think it's in that first lesson that I actually talk about calibrating using DisplayCal. It's a little bit fiddly, DisplayCal. It's, if you've ever kind of worked with open source software, it's a little bit kind of Heath Robinson, a bit DIY, but it is a free solution and allows you to calibrate other screens. It's very useful if you've got a pattern generator or an Ultra Studio product, and then you can use Resolve to send out the pattern via the Ultra Studio to literally anything that you can hook up to that. So any HDMI or SDI screen, basically, and then you can still calibrate that, which is really useful. And it will generate a LUT, so you can load that in. A lot of monitors let you load correction LUTs directly into them, calibration LUTs into them. And if you can't, and if you've got those Ultra Studio products, not all, but some of the Ultra Studio products allow you to attach a calibration LUT inside the box. So as it's going through the box and out to that display, it's essentially calibrating it that way. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. Worst case scenario, if it's just a screen hooked up as like a second display on your computer, then you can use X-Rite's i1 display software, or i1 profiler software that works with that i1 display probe, and that just creates an ICC profile that you just load in to the system and you can do it that way as well.
Awesome. That's everything on YouTube, mate. I don't know if there's any more in Zoom.
No. Wayne and Alfie, I think, are all answered. Okay. Cool. Well, hopefully this has got people thinking a little bit more about working a color palette into your production, and starting to think about how those colors can support your narrative, and help create. I mean, actually, this promo was very much just about aesthetics, because there was no real visual narrative too much. There's a lot that you can go into in terms of how color supports narrative, and in fact, I talked about that extensively in my mastering color talk, which I did last week, was it, for you guys? So if anyone wants to dive a bit more into, particularly in terms of using examples from features, I think I broke down Blade Runner 2049, Whiplash, great films, absolutely fantastic films. A little bit of The Crown as well. So that there's I've in other places broken down those sorts of, that kind of level of color integration where it's directly feeding into narrative. And I remember the first time, actually, just end on this thought, the first time that I ever became aware that color was used in this fashion in films was when I went to see The Sixth Sense. And I saw The Sixth Sense at before I'd heard anything about it. It's one of those films that you don't want to know anything about before you see it, and I really genuinely didn't, because I saw it in New York. I was an art student at the time. I was at a Bournemouth Arts Institute, and we did there was like a group trip, and we all went across to New York to look at the art galleries, and it was a great trip. And I remember we went out to the cinema one night, and obviously films coming out a lot earlier there than they did here. Hadn't even heard of the film. Went to the cinema, really dodgy rundown cinema in the back streets of New York, and sat there and like was blown away by it. And I kind of became a little bit obsessed by it, and was reading up an awful lot about it, and about M. Night Shyamalan, and found this article that really sort of dug down into his color choices, and the fact that he used red to signify any time where Bruce Willis was kind of there and he's dead. Spoiler. And too late. And like the handle to the basement was red, because that's kind of where his spirit kind of resided. It was really fascinating. It was the first time that I was like, oh my God, this is incredible, because you're not really aware of these things. And sometimes people use that as an excuse. They're like, well, people aren't going to realize, but the whole point is it's subliminal. Like my X-ray chart behind me. So it's all meant to be subliminal, and you're kind of creating a world for people to visualize. And this is the lovely thing about filmmaking. You read a book, you conjure this image in your mind, and it's completely of your own making. No one tells you what image you want to create in your mind when you're reading a book. With a film, we get to take control of that. We get to actually paint that picture for people, and that's really exciting. And that should extend to all aspects of creating imagery, and color and contrast really need to be embedded in that. So yes, your homework, people, if you want to dive into this in more details, watch Hugo, watch The Sixth Sense, and look out for the red things that are red, and sort of dive into it in a bit more detail. And I'm pretty confident that you'll see the rewards. You'll be winning awards in no time with your wonderful color work.
Awesome. I mean, are you happy to leave it there?
I'm happy to leave it there. I think we've gone into a fair amount of detail there, and hopefully, if any other questions pop up, I'll be around for the next half an hour or more. So if people think of things afterwards, they can stick it on Discord, and we can answer those questions in there.
Perfect, mate.
Oh, if something, another place on Facebook, there's a closed Facebook group called Coro Alumni, KORRO Alumni. And you can request access to there. So anyone who's watched these streams, if they've got ongoing questions or anything around the color or anything I've touched on, then they can also ask questions in there, sort of in the longer term. But for now, I'll hang around for the next 30 or 40 minutes and answer any questions that come along.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, like Ollie says, just let us know. And yeah, we'll be back at 2 for the rerunning of this, and I'm sure, yeah, we'll have a fresh new set of questions then as well.
Hopefully, yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks.
All right, Jake.
Cheers, guys.
Catch you later.